My name is Mwenya Kapasa and I'm a social protection specialist. I work for the International Labour Organization in the ILO Lusaka country office. In this module, you'll be introduced to selection and identification processes used in the management of social protection. Some of you may know this as targeting, but we have chosen not to use this word because of its negative association and because this word does not encompass the complexity of the selection process. As you may know from your own experiences, selecting beneficiaries of a social protection scheme is not a simple task. Deciding on which people to prioritize is always a hard choice to make. So this module hopes to untangle the issue by helping you to understand what are the key steps and options available for selecting and identifying beneficiaries for social protection programs. For doing so, this week's activities will help you to master selection and identification processes. And this will focus on the selection process as comprising 4 key stages, which include policy choices, fiscal choices, design choices, and implementation choices. The module will also look at how policy choices are made and how they can determine the inclusion and exclusion of people at later stages in the selection process. We'll also look at how policy choices can be affected by fiscal choices. The module also includes the range of design options for operationalizing these policies and fiscal choices, and selecting beneficiaries, including the implication of these choices. Challenges in implementing those selection processes leading to further exclusion will also be explored. So, we'll now look at the part that covers the basic aspects of selection and identification processes. To get started with the module, we first need to have a clear picture of how the selection processes work and the different choices to be made on the way. We look at the policy choice, we'll look at fiscal choice, we'll look at the design choice, and we'll also look at the implementation choices that have to be made. For the policy choice, governments make decisions on which categories of the population they need to prioritize. And this decision will then feed into the fiscal choice, which will then look at, once the category of the population has been chosen, governments decide on the proportion of the category that can be covered, which is dependent on the amount of fiscal resources that is available. The fiscal choice will then lead on to the design choice, which will look at coverage and also look at how governments need to design an appropriate selection methodology that can identify the correct beneficiaries. And finally, for implementation, once the design is agreed, the selection methodology needs to be implemented on the ground, which involves decisions on registration, mechanism, and also the grievance processes that will need to be followed. We also need to look at what do governments take into account when making decisions on which category of the population to prioritize. The governments will basically take into account, or they would tend to take into account, choices between 2 approaches. These approaches involve the poor relief, which directs social transfers to the category of the population regarded as being poor. Or governments may take an approach, which is a more complex policy direction, by designing their social transfer systems to address challenges and risks faced by individuals across the life cycle. This is called a life cycle approach. In order to address the design choices or design options after government has undertaken the policy and fiscal choices, different design choices are looked at with their strengths and weaknesses. And we'll look at 3 design choices, the first one being the proxy means test. The proxy means test, or the PMT methodology, uses national household surveys to identify proxies held by households, usually based on their demographics, human capital, type of housing, durable goods, and productive assets that have some correlation with household consumption. For this particular choice of design, a set of proxies with the best correlations and which can be easily measured and observed are chosen, and households are surveyed to assess them against these proxies. A score is then generated for each household, which is regarded as an estimate of its consumption, and the household itself is a proxy for the household income. However, a significant disadvantage of the proxy means test is that it has a large inbuilt design error, as there is no perfect correlation between the observed proxies and the real household consumption. As a result, and prior to a household being surveyed, a high proportion of the intended beneficiaries may be excluded. The next design option we look at is a community-based targeting. This option rests behind the fact that the rationale for community-based targeting is based on the belief that communities are relatively cohesive and will naturally want to prioritize those most in need. There are very different types of community-based targeting, and these include wealth ranking, parallel validation, application of external criteria, the great and the good, and community members using on criteria. The main arguments that have been proposed in favor of community-based targeting are that community members are more likely to understand the real situation of each member and therefore can identify those most in need more accurately than government officials. The downside, however, to this type of design is that it is common for more powerful community members to steer selection decisions, while those with less voice can be sidelined. The next design option that we look at is categorical targeting. This establishes eligibility on the basis of specific geographical or demographic characteristics. For example, it will be based on the age, household composition, individual conditions such as an illness, disability, or widowhood. In many occasions, categorical targeting is combined with forms of economic targeting. For example, a number of cash transfers in Africa target selected categories, including vulnerable children, elderly, and people living with disabilities, but also adopt additional economic targeting or filters in the form of the proxy means test and community-based targeting to restrict access to the poor, or at least non-rich households. In some cases, access is provided on a universal basis to all households or individuals falling in the determined category. For example, for social pension, universal disability, or a child grant. We'll now talk about exclusion. And exclusion can occur during the selection and identification process for social protection. 3 examples are given as to how exclusion can occur. The first one is related to undercoverage, which is generally the result of insufficient investment and is linked to the political economy of social protection. Exclusion can also occur as a result of design elements, and this is linked to issues such as the mechanism chosen for selection and whether quotas are used. The last element is related with implementation. Exclusion related to implementation happens because the actual selection process associated with insufficient data collection on some potential beneficiaries, and also because there's limited human resource capacity, limited communication and information flow to beneficiaries, and also because there's a lack of complaints and an appeals system. After this brief introduction to the selection and identification thematic area, you may be wondering how to get more in-depth information on the selection and identification processes for the 4 stages. To keep up with this module, we have proposed some activities that you can undertake in building your knowledge. Having finished the selection and identification module, you'll be able to master the 4 key stages of the selection process and how decisions at each stage are critical in determining who is included and excluded from social protection programs. The comparative advantages and challenges of universal access to social protection programs vis-à-vis poverty-based selection. How significant exclusion from social protection programs can happen during the implementation stage of any selected approach, especially in more complex schemes, and how simplicity in processes is more likely to lead to success. Thank you very much.